James's fingers trembled as he held the pen. Not because the room was cold, not because he was tired, but because on the wide white sheet spread across the center table, a girl in a tattered skirt had just written an answer so clean, so perfect, that his brain refused to accept it. His two friends, Cola and Reuben, stopped laughing like somebody had pressed a mute button on them. The living room that used to feel loud suddenly felt too quiet. Justina didn't smile. She didn't look proud. She didn't even look at them. She simply placed the pen down gently, like it was not a weapon that had just cut James's ego into pieces. Madame Agnes, the old maid standing by the wall with a towel in her hands, made a small shaky sound, half sob, half prayer, because she knew what this meant. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. This was intelligence, the kind people feared when they realized they had mocked it. James swallowed hard, staring at the last line Justina wrote. Then he whispered, almost like he was talking to himself. "How did you do that?" Justina slowly lifted her eyes. Her hair was disheveled, falling around her face. Her blouse was dusty. Her skirt had stains like someone had rubbed her dreams on the ground. But her eyes were calm, strong, like someone who had cried too many times, and had no tears left for nonsense. James's friends stepped back a little, suddenly unsure of themselves. James opened his mouth again, ready to say something, anything, to bring back his pride. But the words died in his throat when Justina spoke in a quiet voice. "You said I was lazy." Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was honest. And it landed in the room like a stone. James blinked. Madame Agnes pressed the towel to her mouth, trying not to cry loudly. Justina's hand rested on the edge of the table as she continued. "You said my mother was lazy too." James's face tightened. His friends exchanged a nervous glance. Justina looked away toward Madame Agnes, then back to the sheet. "I didn't answer you," she said, "because if I talk too much, you will say I'm rude. If I cry, you will say I'm weak." She paused. "So I just solved it." James stared at her, and the fear in his chest grew. Not fear of her harming him, fear of something worse, fear that he had been wrong about her, fear that he had been cruel for no reason, fear that he had become the kind of person he always claimed to hate. Then Reuben, trying to save the mood, forced a laugh. Maybe she has seen it before. But his laugh sounded fake, like an empty bottle rolling on the ground. Justina didn't even turn her head. "I've never seen it before," she said. Cola scoffed, but his eyes were wide. "Then who taught you? Your mother?" Madame Agnes flinched like the words slapped her. Justina's jaw tightened. "She didn't go far in school," Justina said softly, "but she tried to make me learn with the little she knew. When she was tired after cleaning, she still asked me questions." Her eyes flicked to Madame Agnes again. "She is not lazy. She is tired." That was when something cracked inside James, not a small crack, a big one. The kind that changes you. He stared at the sheet again. The equation was the type older students would run from. The type people would call impossible to make themselves feel better. And Justina solved it in minutes. Not sweating, not shaking, not begging for help. James felt heat rise behind his eyes. He fought it, because rich boys were taught not to cry. But his throat burned anyway. Then, in front of everyone, James did something nobody expected. He stepped forward, and he dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the marble floor was loud. Madame Agnes gasped. Cola's mouth opened like he forgot how to breathe. Reuben's eyes darted around like he wanted to run out of the house. James looked up at Justina, still kneeling, and his voice came out rough. "I'm sorry." Justina didn't move. James swallowed. "I'm sorry for judging you," he said again, louder now, like he wanted the words to be heard by the ceiling and the walls and the whole mansion that had watched him act proud for too long. "I'm sorry for insulting your mother." Madame Agnes's knees went weak. She held the wall for support, tears spilling freely now. James's voice broke. "I thought you were nothing. I thought you were just the maid's daughter." He shook his head slowly. "But you are. You are smart. You're a genius." The room stayed silent. Justina's fingers curled slightly as she stared down at him. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and steady. "I don't need you to kneel." James froze. Justina leaned forward a little, still not smiling. I need you to understand, she said. Words can make someone feel like they don't deserve to live. That sentence hit James like a slap. His chest tightened. He lifted his head more, eyes shiny now. I understand, he whispered. Justina looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. And that small nod felt heavier than any punishment James had ever received, because it meant she heard him. It didn't mean she trusted him. It didn't mean she forgave him yet, but she heard him. James stood up slowly, like his legs were made of stone. Reuben cleared his throat. So, what now? He asked, trying to act normal, but his voice cracked like a teenage boy. Justina picked up the pen again, not to write, just to hold it. She glanced at the big sheet. Then she turned and walked toward Madame Agnes. Madame Agnes's face was wet, her cheeks shaking. Justina reached out and gently held her mother's hand. Madame Agnes grabbed her fingers like she was holding on to life itself. My daughter, Madame Agnes whispered, voice trembling. My daughter. Justina didn't say anything. She just held her mother's hand tighter. Then she looked over her shoulder at James and his friends. Her eyes weren't proud. They weren't mocking. They were simply tired. I'm going back to my room, she said. James quickly stepped aside to let her pass. Cola did too. Reuben's head lowered in shame. Justina walked out with Madame Agnes, leaving the white sheet on the table like evidence of a crime. The moment the door closed behind them, James turned on his friends. Get out, he said sharply. Cola frowned. Guy, calm down. It was just jokes. James's eyes flashed. Jokes? He repeated. You saw her? You saw what she did. And you still want to call it jokes? Reuben shifted. James, we didn't know. That's the problem, James snapped. We didn't know, and we still mocked her. Silence again. Cola scoffed like he didn't want to feel guilty. Okay, so she's smart. Big deal. James stepped closer, his voice low now, dangerous. It is a big deal, he said, because my mother runs a tech company, and if she hears about this, if she meets Justina. Reuben blinked. Wait, you're going to tell Madame Judith? James hesitated. The name Judith carried weight in that mansion. Judith Heartwarming, the billionaire CEO. A woman who hated disrespect. A woman who didn't tolerate cruelty. If Judith found out what James had done, she wouldn't just scold him. She would break him with disappointment. James swallowed hard. He looked at the door Justina had walked through. Then he spoke, voice shaky. I have to tell her. Cola's eyes widened. Are you crazy? Your mum will finish you. James's hands clenched. I deserve it, he said. Then, just as James turned to head upstairs, toward his mother's private office wing, his phone buzzed loudly on the table. He glanced down, and his blood went cold, because the caller ID showed a name he did not expect to see. Mum Judith James stared at the screen like it was about to explode. Had someone already told her? Had she been watching on the security cameras? Was she calling to ask why there was shouting in her house? James's throat dried. Reuben backed away slowly. Cola whispered, answer it. James's finger hovered over the screen. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then he picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. Hello, Mum, he said, trying to sound normal. Judith's voice came through calm, too calm. James, she said, come to my study, now. James's breath caught. Yes, Mum, he whispered. The call ended. He stood still for 2 seconds, frozen. Then he looked at his friends. Leave, he said again, but this time it sounded like fear. And as they rushed out, James turned toward the hallway leading to Judith's study. His steps were slow, heavy, like he was walking to judgment, because he suddenly had a terrifying thought. What if Judith didn't call him because of the shouting? What if she called him because she had already met Justina? And what if Judith already knew something about Justina that even Justina didn't know? James reached Judith's door. His hand lifted. He knocked once. From inside, Judith's voice came, sharp and controlled. Enter. James pushed the door open. And the first thing he saw made his stomach drop. Justina was already inside, standing in front of Judith's desk, Madame Agnes beside her, still wiping tears. And Judith, billionaire CEO Judith Heartwarming, was staring at Justina like she was looking at something precious. and painful. James froze in the doorway because Judith's eyes were wet, and billionaires like Judith did not cry for nothing. Then Judith turned slowly to James and said, "James, do you know what you almost destroyed today?" James couldn't speak. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Judith stood up from her chair, and her voice shook with anger and something deeper. Something like fear. "Sit down," she ordered. James obeyed, legs weak. Judith pointed at the white sheet on her table. It was the same sheet, the same equation. She looked at James like a judge, and then she said the words that made James feel like the ground was opening under him. "I tested her again, and she solved my hardest problem too." James's eyes widened. Justina looked down, silent. Madame Agnes held her breath. Judith's voice dropped to a whisper. "And James, the way she solved it." Judith leaned forward. "It's the same method my late father used." James's heart slammed, because Judith's father had been a legendary mathematician, and almost nobody knew his secret method. Judith stared at Justina like she was seeing a ghost. Then she looked back at James, eyes burning. "Tell me the truth," Judith said. "Why were you mocking her?" James opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Justina suddenly lifted her head and spoke first. Calm, quiet, but shaking the entire room. "It's okay, Ma. I'm used to it." And those simple words hit Judith so hard, she pressed a hand to her chest. Judith's voice broke. "Used to it?" she repeated. James felt tears rise, because he suddenly realized this was no longer just about an insult. This was about a girl who had been broken many times, and still carried brilliance inside her. Judith took a deep breath, then said slowly, "Justina, where did you learn this?" Justina hesitated. Madame Agnes's hand shook. James couldn't breathe, because in that moment it felt like a hidden secret was about to come out. A secret that could change Justina's life forever. And Justina finally answered, in a voice barely above a whisper, "My father taught me, before he died." Judith's face turned pale. Her lips trembled, and she whispered one name that made James's eyes widen in shock. "Anger de Benedict Equem?" James's head snapped toward his mother. Because that name was Judith's father's name, and Justina had just said it like it belonged to her too. The room felt smaller the moment Judith said the name. Enger, Benedict Equem. It was as if the air itself froze. James felt his heart slam against his ribs so hard it hurt. That name was not just any name. It was the name that hung on the walls of the mansion in framed pictures. The name written on plaques, awards, and buildings. The name spoken in whispers whenever people talked about genius, discipline, and legacy. Judith's father. A man the world respected. A man who was supposed to have had only one child. Her. Judith slowly stood up from her chair, her movements careful, like she was afraid one wrong step would break something fragile. "Justina," she said softly, her billionaire confidence suddenly gone, "say that again." Justina's fingers tightened around the edge of her blouse. Madame Agnes shifted closer to her daughter, fear clear on her face. "My father's name," Justina repeated quietly, "was Benedict Equemi." James's ears rang. Judith shook her head slowly, as if she was trying to wake herself from a bad dream. "That's not possible," Judith whispered. "My father never mentioned another child, never." Justina nodded. "I know," she said. "He told me to never tell anyone. He said it would only bring trouble." Judith's breath came out shaky. James watched his mother closely. He had never seen her like this. Not when deals failed, not when companies collapsed, not even when competitors tried to destroy her empire. But now, she looked scared. Judith walked around the desk and stopped in front of Justina. "How did you meet him?" Judith asked. Justina hesitated. Madame Agnes squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay, my child," she whispered. "Tell her." Justina swallowed. "He was sick," she began. "Very sick. I was younger then. We lived in a small room behind the old library near the railway. One day, he collapsed outside." James frowned. He remembered that library. It was abandoned, forgotten. "He asked for water," Justina continued. "Everyone passed him. I brought water. My mother helped him up." Madame Agnes nodded, tears forming again. We didn't know who he was, she added softly. We just helped. Justina looked up at Judith. He stayed with us for weeks. He taught me math to distract himself from pain. He said numbers helped him forget fear. Judith's lips trembled. That was his habit, she whispered. When he was worried, he taught. James's stomach twisted. Justina continued, her voice steady but sad. Before he died, he told me his name. He said if I ever met Judith Ekwemi, I should run the other way. Judith closed her eyes. He said you were powerful, Justina added, and power attracts enemies. The room went silent. James felt sweat form on his palms. This wasn't just about intelligence anymore. This was about blood, secrets, family. Judith opened her eyes slowly. Why didn't you come to me? She asked. Her voice wasn't angry, it was broken. Justina shook her head. We tried. Madame Agnes spoke now, her voice shaking. We went to the gate of the old headquarters. Security chased us away. They said we were beggars. James flinched. Judith looked away, pain flashing across her face. I didn't know, she said quietly. I swear I didn't. Justina nodded. I believe you. That simple sentence made Judith inhale sharply. Then Judith straightened her shoulders. The billionaire CEO was slowly returning, but this time mixed with something softer. James, she said suddenly. James jumped. Yes, Mum. Did you know any of this? She asked. James shook his head quickly. No, I swear. I thought she was just… He stopped himself. Just what? Judith pressed. James lowered his eyes. Just the maid's daughter. The words tasted bitter now. Judith sighed deeply. That, she said, is how injustice survives. She turned back to Justina. I don't know yet what this means, Judith said. I don't know if my father truly had another child, but I do know one thing. She picked up the white sheet again. No child solves problems like this by accident. James nodded slowly. Judith's eyes hardened with resolve. You deserve education, she said firmly. Real education, the kind that opens doors. Madame Agnes gasped softly. Justina froze. Ma'am, Judith raised her hand. I'm not done, she said. She walked to her desk and pressed a button. My PA will prepare documents. James's eyes widened. Mum? Judith turned to him sharply. Be quiet. She looked back at Justina. I'm offering you a full scholarship, Judith announced. Cloud engineering, 4 years. Abroad or here, you choose. Madame Agnes cried out loudly this time, falling to her knees. Thank you, Ma. Thank you, she sobbed. Justina stood frozen, like someone afraid to blink. Why? She whispered. Judith's voice softened. Because brilliance without opportunity is cruelty, and because I owe my father the chance to be remembered properly. James swallowed hard. Judith turned to him. And you, she said coldly, will learn humility the hard way. James nodded, shame burning in his chest. That night, James barely slept. He kept seeing Justina's calm eyes, hearing her quiet voice. I'm used to it. The words haunted him. The next morning, Justina and Madame Agnes moved out of the servants' quarters into a small guest room. Not luxury, just dignity. James watched from the corridor as his mother's staff treated Justina differently now, some with respect, some with fear. He felt sick. Weeks passed. Justina started classes. James watched her leave every morning, books in her arms, head held a little higher. Something inside him shifted. He wanted to apologize again, properly, but words felt useless now. One evening, James found her in the study. She was reading quietly. I was wrong, he said, standing at the door. Justina looked up. I know, she replied. James hesitated. Can I help you study? Justina studied his face carefully. Then she nodded. Okay. Time moved fast after that. Years passed. Justina grew stronger, smarter, confident. 4 years later, she graduated as the best student. Judith hired her immediately. James, now a software engineer, worked in the same company. They rode to work together, laughed together, healed slowly. Love crept in quietly. One rainy evening, James knelt again, but this time with a ring. Justina cried as she said yes. Their wedding was grand. Madame Agnes walked Justina down the aisle, shaking with joy. Judith clapped with tears. A year later, twins were born. Nathaniel, Natalia. As Judith and Madame Agnes held the babies, they smiled through tears. Love had won, kindness had healed, forgiveness had changed everything. But late one night, as Judith sat alone in her office, a private investigator's file lay open on her desk. The DNA report had arrived. Judith's hands shook as she read the final line. Probability of biological relationship, 99.9%. Judith whispered, voice trembling. So, it's true. And at that moment, far away, a man in a dark suit smiled as he watched the mansion from his car. After all these years, he murmured, the truth is finally out. He picked up his phone. Begin phase 2. The engine started, and Judith had no idea that the biggest danger to her family had just begun. The rain fell softly on the mansion roof, but inside Judith's office, the air was heavy. Judith sat alone, the DNA report still open on her desk. She had read it 3 times already, yet her hands continued to shake as if she had just seen it for the first time. 99.9%. The number burned into her mind. Justina was not just a gifted girl, she was family. Judith leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Memories rushed in. Her father's long absences, the secrets he never explained, the sadness in his eyes toward the end of his life. So this was it, Judith whispered. This was what you were hiding. She pressed a hand to her chest and took a deep breath. She should have felt happy, but something felt wrong. Too quiet, too smooth. Judith opened her eyes and stared at the office door. Her instincts, honed by years of business battles, were screaming. Someone else knew, and whoever it was waiting. Downstairs, laughter filled the living room. Justina sat on the couch, one twin asleep on her chest, while the other rested in Madame Agnes's arms. Nathaniel's tiny fingers curled around Justina's blouse, while Natalia made soft sounds in her sleep. Madame Agnes smiled through happy tears. God is faithful, she whispered. If I die today, I have seen heaven. Justina laughed gently. Mama, don't say that. Madame Agnes shook her head. Look at you. Look at these children. Who would believe it? Justina looked down at her babies, her heart full. Across the room, James watched them quietly. Sometimes he still couldn't believe this was his life. The girl he once mocked. The girl he once humiliated. Now his wife, the mother of his children. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, guilt mixed with gratitude. He walked over and sat beside Justina. You okay? He asked softly. She nodded. Just tired. James smiled. I'll carry Nathaniel. He carefully lifted the sleeping boy and held him close. Madame Agnes stood up slowly, stretching her back. Let me take Natalia to the crib. As she walked away, James leaned closer to Justina. My mum seems distracted lately, he said. Justina frowned. I noticed. James hesitated. She hasn't told you about the DNA test, has she? Justina shook her head. No, she's been quiet. James sighed. That worries me. Justina placed a hand on his arm. Your mother is strong. She will talk when she's ready. James nodded, but the unease didn't leave his face. 2 days later, the danger showed its face. Judith arrived at work early, determined to focus. She had meetings lined up back to back, important deals, important people. She needed normalcy. As she stepped into the elevator, a man in a dark suit joined her. Tall, calm, polite smile. Good morning, Mrs. Heartwarming, he said smoothly. Judith stiffened. I'm sorry, she replied. Do I know you? The man smiled wider. Not personally, but I know you. The elevator doors closed. Judith felt her instincts scream again. I'm in a hurry, she said. State your business. The man nodded. Of course, my name is Victor Hale. Judith's heart skipped. That name. She remembered it from her father's old files. Victor Hale, business partner turned rival. A man who vanished years ago after a quiet scandal. What do you want? Judith asked coldly. Victor leaned back against the wall, unbothered. Just a conversation. The elevator stopped. Before Judith could step out, Victor spoke again. "Your father was a brilliant man," he said casually, "but he made mistakes." Judith froze. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Victor's eyes gleamed. "He trusted the wrong people." Judith turned slowly. "Say your point." Victor smiled. "I heard you recently discovered a family surprise." Judith's breath caught. She stepped out of the elevator sharply. "Follow me," she said through clenched teeth. Inside her office, the door slammed shut. Judith faced Victor. "How do you know about Justina?" she demanded. Victor chuckled softly. "Ah, so her name is Justina." Judith cursed inwardly. Victor walked around her office, examining the awards, the photos. "You see," he said, "your father owed me, not money, legacy." Judith crossed her arms. "My father is dead." Victor stopped and looked at her. "But his blood is alive," he said quietly. Judith felt cold. "What do you want?" she repeated. Victor's smile faded. "I want what should have been mine," he said. "Your company." Judith laughed sharply. "You're joking." Victor leaned forward. "Your father promised me a share. He broke that promise." Judith shook her head. "You have no claim." Victor straightened. "But I do," he said calmly. "And so does the girl." Judith's heart pounded. "What are you saying?" she asked. Victor smiled again. "If Justina is truly his child, then legally she has rights." Judith's blood ran cold. Victor took a step closer. "Rights that can destroy your empire." That evening, Judith drove home in silence. Her mind raced. Victor Hale, Justina, the twins, James. Everything felt fragile. When she arrived home, she found Justina in the nursery, humming softly. Judith watched her quietly, so gentle, so unaware. "Justina," Judith said softly. Justina turned. "Ma." Judith stepped inside and closed the door. "We need to talk." Justina nodded. Judith sat down heavily. "There is a man," she began, choosing her words carefully. "A dangerous man." Justina listened, calm. "He knows about you," Judith said. Justina stiffened. "Knows what?" "That you may be my father's child." Justina inhaled sharply. Judith reached for her hand. "I will protect you." Justina's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want trouble." "I know," Judith said gently, "but trouble may be coming." Justina looked down at her sleeping babies. Fear crept into her voice. "Will they be safe?" Judith swallowed. "I don't know." That night, as the house slept, a black car stopped outside the gate. Inside, Victor Hale watched the mansion. He made a call. "She knows," he said calmly. "Proceed." The line disconnected. At that exact moment, James woke up suddenly. His heart was racing. He didn't know why. He just knew something was wrong. He stood up and walked to the window, and froze, because outside, near the gate, a shadow moved. Then another. James's breath caught. He reached for his phone. Before he could dial, the lights went out. The entire mansion plunged into darkness. From downstairs, a scream pierced the silence. "Justina!" James ran, and as he rushed down the stairs, one terrifying thought echoed in his mind. This was no longer about the past. This was war. Darkness swallowed the mansion like a living thing. James ran barefoot down the stairs, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would tear through his chest. The scream echoed again, sharp, panicked, and he knew it came from the nursery. "Justina!" he shouted. Somewhere behind him, Judith's door flew open. "James," she called, "security." But there was no response. The generator didn't kick in. The lights stayed dead. That was when James knew this wasn't a power failure. This was planned. He reached the bottom of the stairs and nearly collided with a figure moving fast through the hallway. He grabbed blindly, catching fabric. "Who are you?" James yelled. The figure twisted free and vanished into the darkness like smoke. From the nursery came the sound of crying. "Natalia!" James ran again. Inside the nursery, the moonlight coming through the window revealed chaos. The crib was tilted. A chair lay on its side. Justina stood frozen in the middle of the room, clutching Nathaniel tightly to her chest, her face pale with terror. Natalia's cries came from the floor. James rushed forward and scooped his daughter up. "Are you hurt?" he asked Justina urgently. She shook her head, tears streaming. They tried to take her, she whispered. Someone tried to take Natalia. James's blood ran cold. Judith appeared at the doorway, breathless, phone in hand. Lock the room, she ordered sharply. All of you, stay here. James stared at her. Mum, what's happening? Judith's face was hard, but fear flickered in her eyes. Victor Hale, she said. He's moved faster than I expected. At that moment, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then came back on. Security alarms began to scream. Footsteps thundered through the corridors as guards rushed in. But whoever had entered the house was already gone. The police arrived within minutes. Statements were taken. Security footage was reviewed. But the intruder had worn gloves, a cap, and moved through blind spots like someone who knew the mansion very well. Too well. James sat on the couch, holding Natalia close while Nathaniel slept against Justina's shoulder. Madame Agnes stood nearby, shaking, whispering prayers over and over. Judith paced the room. This was a warning, she said finally. Not a kidnapping. Justina looked up sharply. A warning. Judith nodded. Victor wants to scare us, to show us he can reach you. Justina's hands trembled. Why me? Judith stopped pacing and faced her. Because you are the key, she said quietly. James frowned. Key to what? Judith hesitated, then she spoke. To my father's legacy. The words hung in the air. The next morning, Judith called an emergency family meeting. No staff, no phones, just the four of them and Madame Agnes. Judith sat at the head of the dining table, her face tired but determined. I didn't want to say this yet, she began, but we no longer have that luxury. She slid a file across the table. James opened it. His eyes widened. Shares? He asked. Legal documents? Judith nodded. My father left instructions. They were hidden, delayed, but real. Justina stared at the papers without touching them. What does this mean? She asked softly. Judith met her eyes. It means my father acknowledged you. Not publicly, but legally. Madame Agnes gasped and covered her mouth. James looked between them. So, Justina owns part of the company? Judith nodded slowly. A significant part. Silence fell. Justina pushed the file away gently. I don't want it, she said. Judith stiffened. You don't understand. Justina looked up, her eyes filled with fear, not greed. I only wanted education. A life. Peace, she said. Now someone wants to hurt my children. James reached for her hand. We won't let that happen. Judith leaned forward. Victor Hale believes if he controls you, he controls the company. Justina shook her head. I won't let him use me. Judith's voice softened. That's why we must act first. 2 weeks later, the company announced a major public event. A tech innovation launch, media everywhere, investors invited. Judith stood at the podium, calm and confident, while Justina watched from backstage with James. Why are we here? Justina whispered. Judith had insisted. Visibility, Judith had said. Protection. But Justina's stomach twisted. She felt exposed, as Judith spoke about innovation, growth, and the future. Justina felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching her. She scanned the crowd. That was when she saw him, Victor Hale, standing near the back, smiling. Her breath caught. James noticed immediately. What is it? Him, Justina whispered. James's jaw tightened. Stay calm. Judith continued her speech. Then Victor raised his hand. Mrs. Ekweme, he said smoothly when the microphone reached him. Beautiful presentation. Judith smiled tightly. Thank you, Mr. Hale, he said. Victor Hale. A murmur ran through the room. Judith's smile didn't falter. Do you have a question? Victor nodded. Yes, about legacy. The word sent a chill through Justina. Victor continued, would you agree that brilliance should never be hidden, even when it comes from unexpected places? Judith held his gaze. Absolutely. Victor smiled wider. Then perhaps you should introduce your special guest. All eyes turned. James felt anger rise. He's forcing it. Judith paused. Then she did something nobody expected. She stepped away from the podium and gestured toward Justina. Come, Judith said clearly. Justina froze. James squeezed her hand. We're with you. They walked forward together. The room buzzed with whispers as Justina stood beside Judith, holding herself steady. "This," Judith announced, "is Justina Equueme." The name hit the room like thunder. Victor's smile sharpened. Judith continued, "She is one of the brightest minds I have ever seen. And she is family." Cameras flashed. Justina felt dizzy. Victor clapped slowly. "Wonderful," he said. "Then surely she will not mind a small test." Judith's eyes narrowed. "A test?" Victor nodded. "Your father loved tests." James stepped forward angrily. "This is not—" Judith raised a hand. Victor smiled at Justina. "Just a question," he said, "for old time's sake." A large screen lit up behind him. An equation appeared, complex, twisted. Even James felt his head spin. Gasps filled the hall. Victor's voice was calm. "Solve it." Justina's heart raced. Memories flooded back. The living room, the white paper, the mocking laughter. She looked at Judith. Judith met her eyes, steady and trusting. James whispered, "You don't have to." Justina took a deep breath. She stepped forward, picked up the digital pen, and began to write. The room went silent. Minutes passed. The last line appeared. The screen blinked. Correct. The hall exploded into applause. Victor's smile vanished. Judith exhaled. Justina's hand shook, but she stood tall. Victor leaned into the microphone again, his voice low. "Impressive," he said, "but brilliance comes with responsibility." His eyes locked on Justina, especially when secrets are involved. Security moved closer. Judith stepped forward. "This event is over." Victor laughed softly. "For now." As he turned to leave, he looked back at Justina and mouthed 4 words, "I know where you live." Justina's blood ran cold. That night, as they returned home under heavy guard, James held Justina close. "We'll fight," he said. Justina stared out the window, fear heavy in her chest, because she knew something James didn't. Victor wasn't done. And the next move wouldn't be public. It would be personal. Far away, Victor sat in his car, dialing a number. "She passed," he said calmly. "Proceed with the backup plan." The voice on the other end asked, "Which one?" Victor smiled. "The one that forces her to choose." He hung up, and somewhere in the city, a door quietly opened, setting the stage for a decision that could tear the family apart. The phone rang at exactly 2:17 a.m. James was awake. He had not slept since they returned from the event. Every sound felt too loud. Every shadow felt like a threat. When the phone rang, his heart dropped. He answered immediately. "Hello?" A calm voice came through. "Good morning, James." James froze. He knew that voice. "Victor," he said, his tone sharp, "what do you want?" Victor chuckled softly, straight to the point. "I like that." James tightened his grip on the phone. "If you've touched my wife or my children—" Victor cut in gently. "Relax. They are safe, for now." James's chest burned with anger. "Say what you want to say." Victor's voice lowered. "I have Madame Agnes." The world tilted. James felt his knees weaken. "What?" "She's not hurt," Victor continued calmly. "She simply went for her usual early morning walk. My men picked her up." James's breath came out ragged. "If you hurt her—" "I won't," Victor said. "Not if Justina cooperates." James's voice shook. "This is between you and my mother." Victor laughed softly. "No, James, this has always been between blood and legacy." The call ended. James stood frozen. Then he ran. Justina woke to the sound of James shaking her gently. "James," she whispered, half asleep. His face was pale. "They took Mama Agnes," he said. Justina sat up instantly. "What?" James swallowed hard. "Victor, he has her." The room spun. Justina felt her heart pound painfully. "No," she whispered. "Not Mama." James grabbed her hands. "We'll get her back, I swear." Judith burst into the room seconds later. "I heard," she said. "Security is already moving." Justina stood, trembling. "This is my fault." Judith shook her head firmly. "No, this is a criminal's fault." Justina's voice broke. "What does he want?" Judith hesitated. James answered instead. "He wants you," he said, "to sign over your shares." Justina closed her eyes. So this was it. The choice Victor promised. Judith's face hardened. That will never happen. Justina opened her eyes slowly. What if it does? She asked quietly. Judith stared at her. What? Justina's voice trembled. What if I give him what he wants, to save Mama? No, James said sharply. Absolutely not. Judith stepped forward. Victor Hale will not be rewarded for evil. Justina shook her head, tears falling. Mama Agnes carried me on her back when I had nothing. She cleaned floors so I could eat. I won't trade her life for shares. James's eyes filled with tears. We'll find another way. Justina looked at him, her voice soft but firm. What if there is no time? An hour later, Justina sat alone in Judith's study. The contract lay on the desk, her name already printed. All she had to do was sign. Her hands shook. Memories flooded her mind. The living room, the white paper, the mocking laughter, the kneeling apology, the scholarship, the wedding, the twins. Mama Agnes's tired smile. You are not lazy, Mama Agnes used to say. You are just waiting for your light. Justina wiped her tears. She picked up the pen and paused. Then she stood up. No, she whispered. She walked out of the study. Victor's warehouse was quiet. Too quiet. Madame Agnes sat tied to a chair, fear in her eyes but her back straight. She whispered prayers under her breath. The door creaked open. Victor stepped in. Madame Agnes, he said calmly. How are you? She glared at him. God will judge you. Victor smiled. He always does. Later. He checked his watch. She should be calling soon, he said. At that exact moment, sirens exploded outside. Lights flashed through the broken windows. Victor's smile vanished. What? He muttered. The doors burst open. Police flooded in. Hands up, an officer shouted. Victor spun around, only to find Judith standing at the entrance, calm and cold. Behind her was Justina. Victor stared in disbelief. You didn't sign. Justina stepped forward, her voice steady. No, she said, I chose truth. Victor laughed nervously. You think this ends me? Judith raised a document. We traced your calls, your accounts, your men. Police moved in, snapping handcuffs on Victor. As they dragged him away, Victor shouted at Justina. You could have been powerful. Justina met his eyes. I already am, she said. I forgive. I don't destroy. Victor was taken away, screaming. Madame Agnes was untied. She fell into Justina's arms, sobbing. My daughter, she cried, my daughter. Justina held her tightly. I'm here, Mama, she whispered. I'm here. Weeks later, the truth went public. Victor Hale was charged. Judith's father's full story was revealed. Justina officially became part of the family, not because of shares, but because of love. She kept her role at the company, worked hard, stayed humble. James stood beside her, stronger than before. 1 year later, as the twins laughed in the garden, Judith sat beside Madame Agnes, watching them. Judith wiped her eyes. I almost lost everything chasing control. Madame Agnes smiled gently. Sometimes the greatest wealth is choosing kindness. Judith nodded slowly. Justina walked toward them, the twins running ahead. James followed, smiling. Judith stood up and opened her arms. My daughter, she said. Justina stepped into the embrace. As the sun set over the mansion, laughter filled the air. Pain had tried to win, greed had tried to steal, but love had stood its ground. And kindness, quiet, patient kindness, had changed everything. What is your view about this story? Where are you watching from? If you enjoyed this story, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories.